The nation of the East, its people chosen by heaven, is a ray of sunlight shining upon the third Israel. There, the bride to represent earth was born. Sought by humankind for the past 6,000 years, the bride of the Lamb finally arrived. She married a man who has revealed the secrets of heaven. And now, all humankind, suffering from fallen history, greets the true parents, opening the path for humanity with her husband, Reverend Moon. Mrs. Moon, true mother, who will accomplish heaven's wish of creating God's homeland. Her life has been one of total sacrifice for God's providence, and now she conveys the message of true peace to the humanity. As the faithful partner of Reverend Moon, and as the one who represents all women, Mrs. Hak Ja-han Moon has been praying and working all her life in order to establish God's heavenly kingdom of Chon-il-guk. Even today, Mrs. Moon walks the path of Queen of Peace and the true parents, centering on God's true love. At the time of Mrs. Moon's birth, the 1940s were a difficult period for the Korean people, suffering under the Japanese occupation. As the Israelites in Jerusalem under Roman rule 2,000 years ago were spiritually active, centering on John the Baptist, in order to receive Messiah, the 1940s were just the same in Korea, when people were intensely searching for God's way. The spiritual activities in Korea were most active in northern part of Korea. In northern Korea's eastern region of Wonsan, these activities happened centering on males, and in the western region of Chulsan, they happened centering on females. At that time, spiritual activities were proliferating in Pyongyang so much that it was called the Jerusalem of the East. Mrs. Soon A. Hong, Mrs. Moon's mother, was married to a teacher named Sung-un Hong. Their marriage was officiated by Ho Bin-i, a spiritual leader who was leading a movement searching for God's way. The two led a very sincere life of faith. After 10 years of waiting, Mrs. Hong finally gave birth to her first child. Reverend Ho Bin-i told Mrs. Hong about his vision before the baby was born. It was as if a graceful crane was swooping from a pine tree into her embrace. Mr. Sun-un Han also dreamt about a pair of cranes playing with each other in a green pine tree forest. It was a beautiful dream of two cranes, a symbol of peace and good fortune for the suffering Korean people. After having the dream, Mrs. Sun-un Han named her daughter Hak Ja-han. Mrs. Moon was born at Anju in South Pyongan Province on January 6, 1943, by the lunar calendar. When she was about to be born, Mrs. Hong realized her daughter's fate and the works of God at that time. After she gave birth, she had a mysterious dream. Toward the end of Japan's war in the Pacific Ocean, Japanese armies plundered any scrap metals and food they could find in Korea in order to supply their rations and produce weapons. But all of a sudden, everything that was stolen from the Korean people flew across the Hyeonhaetan into her house, filling the rooms. Then Mrs. Hong woke up suddenly. Today, Japanese members provide much support for the true parents' work. Looking back on it now, it seems as if the dream was telling her about the mission of True Mother, who is the representative of all women, and Japan, who is the representative of all Eve nations. On the very day the baby was born, Mrs. Hong dreamt about the hideous Satan. must get rid of the baby now, for she is danger to me, least I shall perish.
Be gone, Satan! Who are you to kill my daughter that I have been longing for so long?
The grandmother comforted Mrs. Hong, who woke up sweating.
It must be because you are weak from the labor. Why does he want her dead, Mother? There is a legend of Johan Jun Mirak, which says the heaven will send its daughter to our family. If Satan tried to harm her in your dream, then the one the legend has foretold must be her. If Satan has his eye on her, we must raise her with great sincerity, Mother. Yes, raise her with great care.
Sometime later, she heard a voice from the heavens saying, "This baby belongs to the Lord, raise her well." She realized that the baby was born with a great mission.
Mrs. Moon received great influence from her mother, Mrs. Hong. Mrs. Hong was born in 1914 at Zhongzhou, which is the same birthplace as Reverend Moon. Mrs. Hong's faith was so strong that she went out and street witnessed in the crossroad between Anju, Huachon, and Gange at a time when the Japanese occupiers were persecuting Christian believers. Mrs. Hong would say, "The Lord does not come upon clouds, but comes wearing physical body." Instead of being shackled by literal interpretation of the Bible, she listened to spiritual revelations and words of truth from heaven. Her mother and the grandmother from the mother's side placed their greatest efforts in preparation in a spiritual church for the coming of the Messiah. August 15th, 1945, Liberation. From then, True Mother's mother told her, "Your father is God." Mrs. Hong continued her life of purity and sincerity, and also raised her daughter in order to meet the Lord, the one to become the heaven's wife. When Mrs. Hong's daughter was 4 years old, she received a great blessing from a spiritual group. Following the Songju Church, the mother of Ho Bin Ho, who was the head of Bokjun Church that was making preparations to welcome the coming Lord, personally gave True Mother a benediction. At the time, Ho Bin Ho was incarcerated in the Daedong Security Office in Pyongyang with Reverend Moon. Since this time, their fate with the spiritual group was mysteriously intertwined by a great sense of purpose.
They brought True Mother to the Songju order at Anju in North Korea to let her receive the benediction from Ho Bin Ho of Bokjong Church, and it is believed that served as True Mother's condition to receive the blessing of meeting Reverend Moon after 3 generations. Mrs. Moon inherited the preparations made for the second advent who will come in flesh, and became the physical embodiment who received that foundation of sincerity. In 1948, determined to find her son, Sun Jong-hung, grandmother Won-mo Jo, decided to head south with Mrs. Hong and the newborn baby. Instead of returning home, he was working at the Army headquarters in Seoul as a medical officer after he finished Waseda University in Japan. It was because he was disappointed by the corruptions of the North, which were different from what they promoted themselves to be. The way south was not easy. They were even captured by North Korean soldiers near the 38th parallel line. They were captured and imprisoned in the barn of an empty house. The soldiers intimidated them. Everyone was petrified with fear. How will they overcome this obstacle? The key to surviving the moment of life and death was love. She took the liberty to run errands of serving food to the soldiers. After being released, the crowd of people was forced back to the north, but they fled again to south with the help of a guide. As the North and South Korean armies were pointing guns at each other everywhere, their journey could not be delayed even for a moment. In the middle of a frightening night, a child's singing voice echoed as the future Mrs. Moon sang. soldiers tried to shoot the moving figures, but stopped when they heard someone singing. The group thanked God for protecting them. The Korean War broke out after they went to the south. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 28th, her uncle, who heard the news of the demolition of Hanggang River, hastened their pace. As soon as they crossed the bridge in his military jeep, the bridge was destroyed. Everyone behind them fell to their death. It seemed that heaven was watching over Grandmother Hong, and her daughter, Mrs. Moon, recalls today that the war made her young life difficult, but she was able to live through its safety because heaven protected her.